It's been a fascinating ride to see the adoption of purpose in the world. It's everywhere.
Yes.
And you see companies embracing it, leaders believing it. PwC did a study with leaders, and about 85% of leaders in Fortune 500 companies now understand the value and the benefits of having a purpose. The vast majority actually say they have a purpose. But then you also see this precipitous drop-off in people saying that they're actually using their purpose to drive their strategy, to drive innovation, to drive M&A, to hold their people accountable, to compensate people. So there's this big gap between believing in the power of purpose and putting purpose to work.
Haley, good to see you. So I want to start with your title. You're the co-founder and chief purposologist, which is such a cool word. I don't know if I've ever heard that word until I read your title, but co-founder and chief purposologist at the Purpose Institute. So give us some context about kind of what you do and the impact you're having on companies.
Okay. Well, first I'll tell you a little bit about one of the individuals who has influenced my work probably most profoundly would be Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And it was the founder of something called logotherapy, which his contention was that most of the anxiety and depression that you see in the world today is a result of people lacking meaning in their lives. And so he created a whole school of therapy called logotherapy to work with people to find the meaning and the purpose in their life that was, in his way of thinking, the antidote to depression, anxiety, and a host of mental illnesses that exist in the world today. And that was born of his time in concentration camps. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, basically shares his story and his discovery that when people lost their sense of purpose, they were not long for essentially taking all those horrific context that you can imagine people endured in that setting, that when people lost their reason for living is when they would soon pass. His work has really inspired me a lot to think about how do we create lives of meaning? And because we spend most of our life at work, what a shame if our workplaces are devoid of meaning. And then I had the very good fortune of having had mentors like Herb Kelleher at Southwest, John Mackey at Whole Foods, Sam Walton and Lee Scott at Walmart, leaders that really thought about what is a problem that we have the wherewithal to solve. And then they were very intentional about stating their purposes so that all of their team members, associates, employees knew that they were there to work in the service of something that mattered. And so I've spent my life trying to help companies think about their deeper purpose in the world beyond making money, not only because I think it's a better way of doing business that leads to higher performance, but also because I think human beings crave and need to live lives of meaning, and what better place to do that than at work.
And so you work with businesses that are at two different inflection points. One, a lot of times they've done no work on their purpose, you could say, and are ready to be activated, and you can equip them with all of those tools to start that journey. And then the second inflection point might be a business that has done some work, but it's not brought to life in the way that it could be. And so I'm curious what some of those barriers or stuck points are that second group of businesses are at that is kind of preventing them from bringing that purpose to life to its fullest.
Yeah, it's a good point, and your question is well framed, because when we started doing this work about 25 years ago, there were just a handful of pioneers in the field of purpose. You had the Herb Kellehers at Southwest Airlines, you had the John Mackeys at Whole Foods, you had Kip Tindall at the Container Store. There were some people that were essentially entrepreneurs that had created businesses that made a difference, and we, as their partner, help them articulate that purpose and then bring it to life in a lot of ways beyond what they were already doing, which was really fun. But back when we started, purpose was kind of like seen as some hippie trippy thing that people in Austin were into, and not really a legitimate, serious business.
Okay.
You know, we're here to make a profit. So a lot of our work, the first decade of doing this work, was actually getting inside of companies, helping them realize that they did have a deeper purpose beyond making money, and helping them articulate it. And so that was probably 100% of my work for the first decade of having the Purpose Institute. But to your point, now it's been a fascinating ride to see the adoption of purpose in the world. It's everywhere.
Yes.
And you see companies embracing it, leaders believing it. PwC did a study with leaders, and about 85% of leaders in Fortune 500 500 companies now understand the value and the benefits of having a purpose. The vast majority actually say they have a purpose. But then you also see this precipitous drop off in people saying that they're actually using their purpose to drive their strategy, to drive innovation, to drive M&A, to hold their people accountable, to compensate people. So there's this big gap between believing in the power of purpose and putting purpose to work.
Okay.
And I would say, I don't think in terms of what those barriers are or the challenges, I think it's often just a muscle that hasn't been built yet.
Okay.
That's just, there's no malicious or negligence. It's just people don't think about, how do I use this purpose and put it to work to drive the business in meaningful ways? So we always try to advise people that your purpose is not like some separate, it's not a separate body of work that you're going to engage in that's separate and apart from the core business. Look at it, we use like acronyms as the life, purpose life. And life stands for the lens I filter everything through.
Okay, love that.
Whatever is on your to-do list, I want to know like what's real for you. What are you working on? And now if you put your purpose up and looked at that project through the lens of your purpose, how would it take shape differently? Like what would you do differently if you thought about this is an opportunity for me to fulfill the purpose in a new and interesting way. And it may not be obvious or evident that this is an opportunity for purpose fulfillment. So it takes a little bit of like, how could this be? And that was what was fun working with everything I learned about purpose. I came from Southwest Airlines, and having worked with them for 15 years, every assignment we got, we just took the step of say, how could this be an opportunity to fulfill the purpose? So for example, when they went to, they conceived of themselves as being in the freedom business. All those low fares, frequent flights, friendly people were in the service of giving people the freedom to fly. Then when we had projects come up like we need a loyalty program, it was like, okay, there's this typical way that you'd go about developing loyalty programs that are conventional in the industry. But what if we put freedom as the litmus test for our thing? Well, how would we design it then? Well, we'd want it to have the fewest blackout dates. And basically, we designed it where you could have 100% of the seats on a plane, rapid reward redemptions. So the idea was, why don't we create a loyalty program that people are actually free to use? Because the biggest problem with most loyalty programs is they're too restrictive. There's like 3 dates or, you know. So anyway, that's just how we encourage. That's the starting point, is what's on your to-do list, and let's be really intentional about what would that look like if you were to put your purpose to it.
So a lot of companies that you've interacted with then would feel really good about articulating it and hammering it on the wall, and there it is, and they stand back and they're like, we did it. We have a purpose, right? But then days, months go by, and they're kind of like, what happens? It's just kind of just isn't activated. It's flails, or they reverse back to nothingness because there's no activation plan on how to make it part of the living, breathing.
That's right. It's funny when you say put it up on the wall. Chip Conley, I just admire and love dearly. He talks about purpose is, a lot of times people think of having a purpose like a noun, like it is this thing you put on the wall, and your purpose should be a verb. And even if you take the simple thing like a hammer, and people say, well, what's a hammer good for? Well, if you just leave it on the shelf, it's not good for much. You got to pick the hammer up and use it to build things. And then you can be a master craftsman with it. Or you're probably going to start small, like, build just a little thing, but then you'll get the knack, you'll get the hang of it, and you'll start utilizing it more. Another thing that's often an important thing to do when you're launching purpose is there's oftentimes a big elephant in the room where people know, like, if we are going to walk the talk and be congruent with what we say we stand for, we got to address this. And I would say CVS is probably one of the boldest people in tackling the elephant in the room, which for them, their purpose was about putting people on a pathway to health. So clearly, you probably didn't take a whole lot of guessing to say, what's the elephant in the room? They sell tobacco products. A lot of tobacco. It was $1 billion business. And they made the decision to say, if we're going to be in integrity with our purpose, we got to stop selling tobacco products. And they did, which is now, and you can imagine if you're an employee at CVS and you know that CVS has made the decision to stop doing that it's real, that this purpose thing is real. It's not just, we're not just trying to pat ourselves on the back and make ourselves feel good. And when you walk into a CVS too, you can see the minute clinics, you can see they've done an enormous work to shift the quality of the products that they carry from a retail perspective. Because there are other pharmacies who half the stuff they sell in the front of the store is what makes you have to use the pharmacy in the back of the store. So it's so you know what I mean? So CVS is doing a lot to actually help with the well-being of the products that they carry in the front of the house. So that's just another thing that I encourage companies to do, is take stock of where you know you're out of step with your purpose and address that first, because that'll go gangbusters to helping convey the sincerity and seriousness.
In the case of CVS, CVS, that's a huge leap of faith to say we're going to cut out $1 billion worth of our business, hopefully find new revenue streams with our purpose. Do you feel like they've successfully come to the other side of that? I mean, that's a big change.
It's a big change. And I would say it definitely had an impact on reducing smoking habits. They did a study with the Department of Health, and it actually showed that quit rates among CVS shoppers increased by about 20 to 30%. So they didn't just leave and go buy their cigarettes elsewhere. It actually was enough of an impediment that it stopped them. So I always look at impact first and foremost of did that move actually help you fulfill your purpose in a meaningful way?
Right.
And then their business, I know there was a little bit of a hit in the beginning, but they are definitely a more financially stronger company than their biggest competitor today.
Walgreens. Yeah, still selling smokes.
It's a good example.
You go in there and it's
similar. A lot of companies have very similar purpose statements in a category, and that's okay. The difference is, are you going to pay the price and put some skin in the game and actually have a business model that reflects what it is you say you're trying to do? And if you walk into it's a perfect example. If you walk into CVS versus Walgreens, I met with a sea of cigarettes, potato chips, sodas, and then the farm. By the way, there's the pharmacy you're going to need later. So, yeah.
Okay, so good segue to walking the walk, talking the talk. So First United Bank is someone that you have been partnering with and helping guide from a strategic standpoint for years. We've more recently had the pleasure of working on that business. But we're talking about a community bank out of Durant, Oklahoma. I want to just kind of dive into this as a little bit of a case study of how purpose can come to life in a really special way, because banks aren't typically known for the things that they're known for. So if you could talk about that a little bit, like where were they when you started working with them and where are they now?
Yeah, First United Bank is an extraordinary example of how you can be purposeful in any industry and any category. I met Greg Massey, who is the CEO of First United Bank, through the Conscious Capitalism community, which is a community that's dedicated to helping businesses think about 4 things really: higher purpose beyond making money, conscious leadership, multi-stakeholder model, and a values-based culture. And Greg Massey has really embraced those tenets and brought them to life at First United Bank. Their purpose is to inspire and empower people to spend life wisely. And the way that they think about a life well spent is a life that has 4 pillars. The first of which is a life of faith. So they're a faith-based organization. Obviously, they're a bank, so their belief in financial well-being being a key part of what is a life well spent. But then they also look at the health and physical well-being of people, as well as people's personal growth and development.
And they're a bank.
Bank.
That's the crazy thing. You're talking about personal development, wellness, health, right?
Right. Exactly. And it actually, they're kind of an interesting origin story of where their purpose came from. Those 4 pillars were originally designed to develop a really strong employee value proposition. It started like that's what they focused on for their people. And then at a certain point, they asked themselves, well, why wouldn't we extend that to our customer base and to our community at large? And so they just kind of elevated it out of essentially the HR people department and said that should be our fundamental purpose as an organization in the world, is to inspire and empower people to spend life wisely. So now what that looks like is way beyond just a robust people program. But when you walk, they've done everything from reimagine what a bank looks like. So if you walk into First United Bank, it doesn't feel or look anything like a bank. They think of them as spend life wisely centers. You'll be greeted with a library that has books from each one of their pillars that are free for anyone that is interested. They host events throughout the week, everything from prayer groups to strength finder sessions to financial planning seminars to 5K walks to anything on the pillars that you want to engage in. They are there with programs, materials, community events for their stakeholders. And one of the super cool things that we just started doing with First United Bank, we're probably going to talk about this in a little bit, is how do you actually measure your purpose and hold yourself accountable to fulfilling your purpose? And especially when it's something like that, which is like, how do we know if we're actually helping people?
It feels all kind of squishy, right? Because you're like, how do we know if we're doing a good job here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I always encourage any company to think about not only your key performance indicators, which is what makes your purpose possible, but also key purpose indicators. How are we going to know if we're fulfilling our purpose? And so we actually worked with a major research institution to help design what we call the Spend Life Wisely Index. And it's a survey. The first one was fielded last spring, and we're planning on doing it annually to look at how are we impacting people's faith, financial well well-being, physical well-being, and personal growth and development across different measures like subjective measures, like how stressed were you about work today? Or did you have the energy you needed to do what you wanted to do today? So kind of subjective things. We look at objective measures like what's your credit score? Some things that are a little more tangible. And then we look at behavioral activity that we know correlates positively with each of those things. And so what we found after doing the first survey was when people utilized the products and offerings from First United Bank, we saw significant increases in their self-assessments across each one of those pillars. Now, the work that we have to do is the utilization was kind of low because people don't think of a bank for their health and personal growth and development. But when they do and when they use those services, big lifts. So we know that what we're doing, the offerings that we're putting out there are actually effective. But from an advertising perspective, Prentice, that comes back to you because door number 3 is their amazing ad agency. The more awareness we can bring to turning to your bank for that kind of relationship and that kind of services, we know that it'll have a positive impact.
United Acts of Kindness is such a cool example of a bank putting energy towards they have a kindness goal. How many acts of kindness can we get? I think it was 350,000 or something. And going out into the communities where they have presence and saying, can we count on you to sign up for certain acts of kindness? It could be that you're going to compliment someone, you're going to get someone a coffee, you're going to help out a coworker. It's these little simple things, like I guess sometimes called random acts of kindness, but this is very intentional. Like, let's do this, let's get people to rally around it, and then we're going to measure it and see how we did. And there's a ticker on the website that says how many acts of kindness people have committed to. I'm going to play devil's advocate. I know why it's important. You know why it's important. But if you are a marketer that might be in another category or something, looking at this from the outside and going, why is a bank spending so much energy on this? Like, isn't it about profit? Like, well, how does this help their bottom line? I mean, so that's not my own opinion, but that's somebody listening might be like, that's cute, but why would we put marketing and energy into that?
Right. Isn't that sad that people still think
Well, I think they do.
But I know they do.
It is sad. But I think that I can definitely say there were people that would look at that and say, that just seems kind of crazy. Why?
It's a paradox that when you pursue profit myopically, you actually make less profit than companies who pursue purpose. The data is pretty conclusive on this point, from everything from Jim Collins, who first wrote Built to Last, where he looked at companies that outperformed their competitors on the order of 8-1, starting with stock market performance. And when he reverse engineered it, what he found was those companies all had clarity of purpose and values-based cultures that animated everything that they did. Raj Sisodia wrote his book, Forms of Endearment. And when you add a multi-stakeholder model where you really care deeply for your employees, your community, your customers, as well as your stakeholders, those companies even outperformed the Built to Last companies. And then McKinsey's done a meta-analysis of over 5,000 companies that operate with these purpose and values principles, and 85% of them outperformed their competitors. It does seem, first blush, like, isn't this a distraction from the business of making money? And the reason that that is a false perception is that when you have a purpose that people care about, and it's actually driving your strategy, and your people are engaged in what they're doing, and you're actually delivering real value to your customers, the profit will ensue from that the performance will follow. And from that, it's not that much of a mystery. But if you start with, like, what do we need to do to make the most profit possible? Surprise, surprise, that's not going to really get your people jumping out of bed in the morning, inspired to go to work. And it's probably not going to generate the most valuable products and services that your customers would actually reward you with their loyalty and their business for. So
it's counterintuitive, isn't it? And key performance indicators is usually the term we associate, the acronym we associate with KPIs. You talk about key purpose indicators. And even the title of this episode is the ROI of purpose. So for someone listening, I love that you've attached that title to it, because it's not ethereal, is it? It's grounded directly into business results. And so talk a little bit about how we can start to shift our thinking. Well, this might be new for someone listening to even think about purpose in this way, and taking it out of the ethereal sense and grounding it right in next to that triple bottom line almost. Can you share a little bit of some of those mental shifts that you help people make as they consider where purpose fits in their business?
Yeah, of course. And I always want to say it's not purpose versus performance. They have to live together. Well, I think Grant Reed, the CEO of Mars, put it well when he said, purpose without profit isn't possible, but profit without purpose isn't meaningful. So you need both of them. Yeah. And so while certainly a company with a track record of performance like Southwest Airlines has KPIs of load factors, market share, profit margin, they also have key purpose indicators to say, what percentage of the market has now flown as a result of our existence. And if you go to their headquarters at Love Field, it was literally when they started in the 70s, only about 15% of people had flown. It was really the domain of the affluent. And now it's over 96% of people had flown. They work with the Department of Transportation to measure the impact on travel when they enter a new market. And it's actually called the Southwest effect. And because travel increases by about 20%. Walmart's another client that we worked with to purpose of to save people money and help them live better. So how do they know they're doing that? Well, they actually track what is the cost of living on households within a 6-mile radius of a Walmart. And they actually lower the cost of living by about $3,400 a year just by virtue of living in Walmart's presence.
Yeah.
So anyway, I love just the task of, if this is your purpose, how will you measure it and know that you are fulfilling it? So that was why First United Bank one, which was a little more ambitious in some ways because we're trying to help people spend life wisely. So how do we develop a tool that'll enable us to gauge people's self-assessment on, do they feel like they're spending their life wisely because they're being good stewards of their money, their faith, their health, and their personal growth and development? It's a fun exercise.
Who engages, like when you do this work, who within the organization is kind of your champion to engage the work and shepherd it along? I mean, because I think you obviously would need involvement from all the stakeholders, really. So maybe touch on how that process even starts and who's involved.
Well, it's interesting, Prentice. We at the Purpose Institute, we're very intentional about always working with the executive team of any organization so that as they go on this journey, it is embraced and executed in meaningful ways. I came from the marketing world. I love using the power of creativity and storytelling to help the good guys win is kind of how I think about it. I mean, it's so, it feels so much better when you're working for a company that really stands for something and you just get to use your creativity to tell their story and make sure people know that there's a good company out there that has their back. Unfortunately, what we found coming out of an ad agency is when you try to introduce the notion of a purpose-driven organization through the door of marketing, it often gets relegated to kind of a brand positioning thing. And it doesn't go upstream enough to the fundamental business. And to me, and in my experience with great purpose-driven organizations, if the CEO and the core leadership team isn't behind it, it'll never be more than just kind of wallpaper or dressing.
That's important to hear and to say, because I feel like some people want to be that internal champion, if you're head of marketing or something like that, and they crave it and they want it. But if you don't have that support and that vision at the top, it's probably not going to happen.
It's probably not going to happen. And it's interesting. I read a case study in HBR and it was looking at Mars Pet Care versus Nestle Purina. They had very similar purpose statements. At Mars Pet Care, it was to create a better world for pets. At Nestle Purina, it was like to make life better with pets. Mars Pet Care, it was a top-down driven purpose that within the portfolio of Mars Company, they wanted to really revitalize the pet food business because it was kind of languishing. No one really wanted to work on it. You can imagine if you're at a company with chocolate and Hershey's and all this kind of stuff, nobody wanted to go work on dog food. But they're like, but if our purpose is to create a better world for pets, and we put that at the center of our growth strategy, what would that look like? And they very quickly realized, well, if we're going to make a better world for pets, we should have veterinary services and we should have incubators that are doing like healthy Fitbit collars for dogs to measure their behavior. We should have a livable cities initiative that increases access for pets and pet parks and city. And it became this dynamic business that everyone wanted to work at. It became the fastest growing business at Mars from a business perspective thing. Then their advertising obviously reflected it, but that was just one element. And the advertisers had so much to talk about because they were engaged in so much interesting activity to create a better world for pets. Now you contrast that with the Nestle Purina example. They did a social media campaign showing people having a good time with their dogs and they continued to sell dog food. End of story. I mean, it was just same intent. But because of the stakeholders clearly that were involved with Mars that said, we will make this our purpose and we will drive the business and it will affect M&A, it'll affect everything versus the other one, which is just kind of the standard. It's the problem when you try to do purpose through marketing door and it stays in that marketing room and it doesn't.
Well, yeah, because it needs to affect HR, recruitment, and onboarding, and
everything,
company events, everything, right? So that makes a ton of sense. I'm glad you made that distinction. But when it's created by the executive team and embraced and everyone's in lockstep, it sure makes the marketing team's job easier, doesn't it? And more fun and more like we know what we're doing. It's clearer.
Yeah. And we all know this intuitively. Like when you go to certain companies, like when you walk into a Whole Foods, Whole Foods was another one. This is back in the day. This was 10, 12 years ago. And you walked into a Whole Foods and those team members so passionate about what they were trying to do to kind of re-educate America on how to eat and take on the industrial food system and bring organic foods to market. All of that was based on, I loved, when we were working with them a million years ago, there was a woman named Margaret Wittenberg who was their CMO. She never went to a single ad industry function, to my knowledge, that I'm aware of. But when I would call Margaret to see what she was up to, she was usually on like a sheep farm in Scotland, making sure that the sheep were being treated well. Or she was at a farmer in Bakersfield to make sure they were using ladybugs instead of insecticide. And I loved that because as the marketer, she saw her job was that the brand was living in integrity with what it said it was going to do. She didn't give a flip about golden this or that awards. She cared about living what it is that they said they stood for. And so anyway.
What a fulfilling life and career. Yeah. That's really cool.
I'd
love to be hanging out with the sheep and the ladybugs.
I don't know if you ever have the opportunity to go to an organic farm. I was literally standing in Bakersfield with, I think it was Grimway Farms, and they were like, oh, here comes our pesticide. And they kind of smiled. And I was like, pesticides? And they're like, uh-huh. And then here comes this little, plane, and just tens of thousands of ladybugs were dropped on us. And it was like, you're just standing there. It was magical. It was like it was so sweet. I was like, okay, I love that.
Better than orange pesticide. Yeah.
That is what purpose feels like. A bunch of ladybugs swarming around you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think it's a good takeaway, though, what you had to share around how this activity actually moves forward from the executive level. A lot of our audience are marketing executives sitting on the executive team. And so even an action step from hearing this conversation and hopefully lighting a fire around this topic, maybe reigniting or igniting for the first time around digging deeper well around purpose in the business that they're in. The work to be done is you could be an advocate on that executive team around this topic. What are some of the books you would suggest we arm ourselves with in our audience to get ourselves inspired around this and even bring that executive team along this journey and start it?
Well, I think the Conscious Capitalism book by John Mackey and Raj Sisodia is a good one because it talks about how this is a better way of doing business. It's almost like capitalism 2.0. So it's not anti-capitalism. This isn't woo-woo anything. This is about a good way to develop a high-performing, beloved organization in the world. And there's a supplement, the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, that's more of a workbook that people can use. Raj Sisodia's book, Firms of Endearment, which also looked at the performance that ensues from being a purpose-driven organization. He also wrote a book called The Healing Organization. And I really love that as a metaphor for another way of thinking about purpose is, and his call is for leaders of a company to really look at their ecosystem in which they operate and identify where is there suffering that exists that we have the wherewithal to heal through business. The contention being one of the greatest ways. If you're an idealistic person who wants to make the world better, business is a great venue for doing that. If you're mindful about acknowledging there's so much opportunity in just helping leaders kind of raise their consciousness about where suffering exists. Because I believe when people know better, they do better, as Maya Angelou said. And so just getting people to see, oh my gosh, is there a stakeholder that's suffering? Is there an employee group that's suffering? Is there a consumer segment that's suffering? And I use suffering, kind of loosely, but it's that we could address with some way of doing business, with some innovation. So that's also a good way to think about it. So the Healing Organization, I really liked it because it just brought a new frame for thinking about this.
Thank you. That's helpful. Well, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, this is not woo-woo at all. This is like, you brought so much data and science to it, and it's awesome. And I love hearing you talk about it. So thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. This was a pleasure. I can talk about it forever.
It's really inspiring, and I think people don't allow themselves to sit and ponder it very often, probably, or don't have the benefit of doing that sometimes. And so I think it's a great primer for people that are thinking about it. But it also tells me if you're in an organization where there isn't that passion and motivation to work on it at the top, go work somewhere else. Life's too short. Because
give them the books and then resign. No, I'm kidding.
It's not a bottom-up kind of thing, is it?
That's right. And you know what? I'll just add to that. Yeah. Because this is probably what I should have said when you asked, how did I get into this? There's an interesting ascendance of purpose in the business world that has come about in some part because of so many other avenues for meaning in people's lives have eroded. So if you look at Robert Putnam's work, he wrote Bowling Alone, and then he wrote upswing. He shows how our engagements in civic engagement, community engagement, religious engagement, all of these other avenues peaked in the 50s and 60s and have been on a precipitous decline throughout over the last 5 to 6 decades. And it's kind of bottomed out at this point. And so one of the consequences of that is when you ask people, where do you find meaning in your life, or what is the source of purpose in your life? About 70% of people say work. I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing. It just is the case that today work is people's largest or greatest or most likely source of meaning in their lives.
Is that an American thing more so too, though, or do you find that that's universal? Because I feel like that in Europe, it may not be that, but...
His data shows universal trends. I think in America, it might be more pronounced, but it's not a unique thing to look at.
That's kind of sad.
It is sad. It is sad. But it's one of the reasons that explains why purpose in business, I think, has become such a huge thing, is because in the war for talent, and employees want purpose-driven work. Like, they're looking for employers who are doing something that they believe matters. And if you're not, they don't want to work for you.
Well, and I said it was sad, but I don't really mean it's sad, because the reality is it's a force for good too, though.
Yes.
I mean, if we spend, how much time do we spend at work? So
that's
fantastic, great. Go be somewhere where you feel like you're making a difference, and glad that there's so many organizations are fueled by that now.
Yeah, and a lot of times companies, there is a purpose there. It may not be appreciated, and it's kind of like, let's kind of suss it out, let's surface it. There's something there, or you wouldn't be in business. And then how can we breathe some life into it, articulate it, codify it, so you can do it more intentionally going forward? Anyway,
well, I'm going to do some soul searching based on this conversation, because I feel like it's just one of those things that it's never done either. Like, unless you're Greg Massey, who's got it figured out. I mean, he's really, like, kudos to that organization to just go so far so fast. But there's so much intentionality. But I just think a lot of us, it's you think you got it, but then if you put it on autopilot, you go, oh, that could be better. So there's always a chance to make it better.
Yeah.
And I loved your answer about muscle building, because muscle building takes intentionality, and it takes daily work and those disciplines. And so that's really interesting when I ask what's the stuck point, and it's really just that it's a muscle that needs to be built. So that's a really encouraging, empowering way to frame it.
Yeah. And you know what, Prentice, even with the First United Bank thing, it might have felt like it happened fast.
It felt like that.
It's been 10, 20 years in the making. Okay. And it's like in the rearview mirror, it's like you can see all of these things, from the lobbies to the services and offerings to the programs to the Spend Life Wisely University that they're launching for commercial clients as well as customers. And so you have this amazing case study, but it is a work in progress. It is a muscle that gets built. It takes years over time. And then you look back and can see what you did. But my thing is to start somewhere and just start doing it. And then it'll become second nature to you. It'll become like that. It'll just become like the oxygen you breathe, and it'll start showing up everywhere. I'm currently working on a book called The Parables of Purpose. And if you know the parable of the sower and the seed, where there is seed that falls on concrete and the birds just come and eat it up. There's seed that falls on rocky ground and it kind of takes root and flourishes for a second, but then it's gone. There's seed that falls on thorny ground and it kind of gets choked out. And then there's seed that falls on fertile ground and it takes off and blooms like beauty. And it's a metaphor for essentially open hearts and open minds. Like, are you a closed, concretized surface? And so there's going to be certain companies out there that hear this and they're like, you guys are insane. We're profit.
We're making widgets here.
That's the seed on concrete. There's going to be some that are like the rocky ground, where like they get all excited about purpose. They do a big purpose launch, almost like the bluebonnets in the spring in Texas. They come on, but weeks later they're gone. And you're like, well, what happened? Like, where'd it go? Because they didn't till the soil and they didn't do the work and they didn't tend to it. And then the same for the thorny, choky weeds. That's almost like, to me, that's like the status quo thinking that is going to come back in spite your best intentions to be like, we got to make money. We got to do this. It's all the conventional Milton Friedman. The purpose of business is to make money. And so you're fighting with these incumbent belief systems that are going to do their best to choke out this new way of being and doing. But I found in every company, there is fertile ground where you're going to have a sufficient amount of people who are receptive, who are willing to do the work, who are, willing to nurture it and tend to it, and it'll take off. And then hopefully you can weed out the weeds and kick out the rocks as you go and have a really fertile company for this in the long run.
That's a great metaphor. I love it.
I had to squeeze that in.
That's the social clip I'll send you.
Yeah, no, I was like,
literally.
I was picturing that. She was like, that's the clip. That's Haley's clip.
The whole time you're talking, I'm like, clip.
That's the book preview.
The book preview.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, that makes sense. I don't know.
So you're writing this now? We're done, by the way.
Exciting.
I'm just asking.
Yeah.